The soup hit his left shoulder at 6:49 in the evening. Not a splash, not a drizzle. A full ladle of French onion, dark and scalding, that caught the wool of his jacket and spread in a slow, terrible bloom down his back. The sound it made was soft. The room's reaction was not. 41 guests at the Aldwell Hotel's Autumn Gallery dinner turned at once, the way people turn when something expensive has just been ruined, and what they saw was this. A black man in a white server's jacket, standing very still, his hands at his sides, while a younger server stood behind him with an overturned cart and a face that had gone the colour of chalk. The woman who crossed the floor in 12 quick steps was named Cressida Vane. She was the assistant floor manager, and she wore that title the way certain people wear a coat 3 sizes too large, filling it with posture instead of substance. Her heels struck the parquet with the sound of small authority. She did not look at the server with the cart. She looked at him. "Marcus," she said, and her voice carried. She had a voice that knew how to carry. "I'm going to need you off the floor." He looked at her. "There are guests present," she continued. "This is a gallery event. It reflects on the hotel." He said nothing. His hands stayed at his sides. "I'm sure you understand," she said, and turned her back before the sentence was fully finished. "Now, before I tell you what happened next, I need to take you somewhere else first. I need to take you back 14 years to a Tuesday morning in October when a man named Marcus Ellison walked into the Aldwell Hotel's service entrance carrying a single reference from a catering company in Queens, wearing the only dark pair of trousers he owned, and sat across from a hiring manager who asked him if he had any experience with fine dining. What did Theo Brandt say standing at that far wall when the tray slipped from his hands and fell? Before we get to that, you need to understand who Marcus was. You need to understand where he came from, because the rest of this story, every word of it, only makes sense if you know what he was carrying in the left breast pocket of that soup-ruined jacket. 63 art postcards. His grandmother Ruth had worked in the kitchen of the Aldwell Hotel for 19 years, from 1971 to 1990, and she had never once eaten in the dining room. She had peeled potatoes on a stool near the freight elevator. She had stirred stocks at 4 in the morning while the chandeliers above the banquet hall threw light nobody in her vicinity was permitted to see. She had carried linens and wiped counters and cleaned the floor of the scullery on her knees, and she had done all of this without complaint and without deference, which is a different thing. Deference bends toward the people with the titles. Ruth simply did not bend. She had never been invited to look at the hotel's collection, which by 1985 included 3 oils, 2 watercolours, and a bronze figure that stood in the east corridor near the grand staircase. She had never been included in the staff briefing before gallery events, the briefing where the floor manager walked a selected group through each new piece and its context. That briefing was for the serving staff. The kitchen staff had their own briefing, which concerned portion sizes and timing and nothing else. But she had looked anyway. She looked during shift changes during the 17 minutes between prep and service when the floor was briefly empty. During the 2 minutes it took to carry linens from the back stairs to the banquet closet. She looked the way someone looks at something they have decided belongs to them regardless of what the sign says. Ruth Ellison had a 3rd grade education and a mind that could hold the shape of a painting for 40 years. When the library on Fulton Street held its annual book and materials sale in 1979, Ruth had bought 63 art postcards from a discard bin for 35 cents. The Louvre's collection, the Prado, the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. Postcard-sized reproductions of paintings most people in her neighborhood had never heard of and would never travel to see. A Delacroix cavalry scene in ochre and red, a Vermeer interior with a window and a woman reading a letter, the light falling from the left the way light falls when a painter has studied it long enough to know it has direction. A small Goya that looked cheerful from across a room and revealed itself as something else entirely when you moved closer. Ruth brought them home in a paper bag and spent 4 evenings sorting them on the kitchen table, cross-referencing them against a water-damaged art history text she had found at the same sale for 15 cents, matching names to images, writing notes in the margins in her careful, deliberate printing. She never told anyone why she bought them. She didn't explain herself to people. That was not her way. What she did was teach. Every Saturday when Marcus was old enough to sit still, Ruth would lay 3 postcards on the table and say nothing. She would let him look. Then she would ask him one question, not who painted this and not when was this made. She asked him, what do you see that you didn't see the first time you looked? He was 7 years old the first time she asked it, and he did not know what to say. He looked at the postcard, a Klimt, all gold and pattern, and a woman whose face was tilted and whose eyes were almost closed. He said he saw her dress, the gold of it. He saw her dress? Ruth said, look again. He looked again. He said he saw her hands. Ruth said, look again. He looked for a long time. Then he said, she looks like she's asleep, but she's not asleep. She's listening to something. Ruth said nothing. She put the postcard back in the stack. But her expression, which was not an expressive face, shifted fractionally towards something he could not name then and would spend the rest of his life trying to approximate in his own bearing. A kind of private satisfaction. The satisfaction of someone who has planted something in good soil. That question is the whole of his education. Everything else is detail. Marcus was 22 when Ruth died, and she left him two things: the postcards, rubber-banded, in a shoebox that still held the faint smell of the hotel's kitchen soap, and a small pendant, stamped copper, 2 inches, the shape of an open hand. She had bought it at a street market in 1968 and never taken it off until the week before she died. She pressed it into his palm and told him to keep it somewhere close. She said it had been on her body in every room she had ever been permitted to enter, and several she had not. She said she did not want it buried with her. She wanted it to keep moving. He wore the pendant under his shirt every day of his adult life. He carried the postcards in his breast pocket on every shift, not as superstition, not as performance. He carried them because they were the most valuable things he had ever owned, and the Aldwell was where they had come from, and that fact mattered to him in a way he had never needed to explain to anyone. Let me take you back to that Tuesday morning in October. The hiring manager's name was Portia Samuels, and she asked Marcus if he had experience with fine dining. He told her he had 3 years serving at an event company in Queens and 1 year at a mid-range restaurant in Midtown. She looked at his reference. She looked at him. She asked him what he knew about the hotel's collection. He answered for 6 minutes. He named each piece. He placed each work in its period. He noted that the bronze in the East Corridor was a late work, distinguished from the artist's earlier pieces by a compression of weight through the shoulders that was characteristic of a sculptor revising his own earlier certainty. And he said this the way you say something you have simply observed, and not the way you say something you are trying to prove. Portia Samuels looked at him across the desk for a moment. She hired him before the week was out. That was 14 years ago. He had been on the floor of the Aldwell's dining room, known as the Aldwell Grill, for every gallery event since. He had watched the collection rotate with the seasons. He had watched the staff turn over and new faces arrive and learn the room, and some of them leave and some of them stay. He had watched 3 floor managers come and go, and he had watched Cressida Vane arrive 2 years ago with her hospitality management certificate from a school in Connecticut, and her habit of addressing people by looking at the space slightly to the left of their face. He had noted that habit early. He had not spoken about it. He had done his work. In his 14 years at the Aldwell, Marcus had never been late. He had never lost a table's order. He had never broken a glass or dropped a tray or spoken to a guest in a register that anything other than warm and precise and unhurried. He knew the dining room the way a musician knows a stage, the specific give of the carpet near the east wall, the way the acoustics shifted when the room was full versus half empty, the 3 spots where the natural light from the south windows created a glare that required a guest to be repositioned before they noticed it themselves. He had covered colleagues' sections without being asked. He had learned the names of regular guests' children. He had once, at a corporate dinner, quietly translated a comment made in Haitian Creole by a passing kitchen worker, correcting a misunderstanding between a table and the kitchen that would otherwise have resulted in an allergy incident. And when the floor manager at the time had looked at him afterward and said, "Where did that come from?" he had simply said he had picked up a few things. He had always picked up a few things. That was also not his way to explain. By 6:30 on the evening of the Autumn Gallery dinner, the room held 41 chairs set beneath the hotel's most recent acquisition rotation. 4 new works hung on the dining room's east wall, brought in from a Frankfurt-based curatorial firm whose lead representative, a man named Theo Brandt, had arrived that afternoon with 2 colleagues and a quiet, precise way of inspecting a room. Theo was 34. He had the unhurried movements of a person whose confidence had never required volume. He had walked the dining room at 5:15 before the guests arrived, pausing in front of each work for what seemed like an unreasonable amount of time. Marcus, resetting glassware at a corner table, had watched him without appearing to. He watched Theo stand in front of the first Frankfurt piece, a large abstract in charcoal and umber, and tilt his head to a specific angle. He watched him stand in front of the second, a figurative watercolour, and step back 2 paces to change the distance. He watched how Theo moved, which was the movement of a person who had learned to see and had never stopped practicing. At 5:47, Theo stopped in front of the large oil portrait that hung at the south end of the east wall. This portrait had been there for 31 years. It was not part of the rotation. It did not move. It was the hotel's own piece, commissioned in 1993 by the hotel's founder, a man named August Fawcett, who had made the commission as a private act of gratitude that the hotel's subsequent management had never fully understood, and had therefore never relocated or contextualized or included in any formal accounting of the building's cultural holdings. The portrait showed a black woman seated at a kitchen table, her hands folded, her expression composed and deeply interior. She wore a cotton house dress. On the table in front of her lay 3 small objects: a rubber-banded bundle of papers, a copper pendant, and a bowl. The painter had rendered the light from the left, the way light falls when someone has studied it long enough to know it has direction. Theo Brandt stood in front of it for 9 minutes. Marcus saw him and set his glassware down quietly and watched. He watched Theo tilt his head, step back, step forward again, and then turn slowly and look across the room. Not at anyone in particular. Just looking. The way you look when something has pressed itself against the inside of your understanding, and you have not yet found the word for it. Marcus picked up his glassware and moved back toward the service corridor. At 6:47, the dinner was in its second course. The room had reached the particular warmth of good wine and genuine conversation that a well-run gallery event produces when nothing has gone wrong yet. The 4 Frankfurt pieces on the east wall drew glances and occasional pauses between courses, guests stepping close with their glasses to look, the low murmur of approval that sophisticated people use to indicate they recognize something even when they are not entirely certain what they are recognizing. At 6:49, the cart went over. The server who had been wheeling the soup tureen was named Danny, 19 years old and 3 weeks into the job. She had caught her foot on a raised seam in the carpet runner near the east wall, a seam Marcus had reported to facilities twice in the past month, and that had not been addressed. The tureen lurched to the right. She grabbed for the handle with both hands. The handle turned. The soup went sideways and down, and the closest body in its path was Marcus, who had been moving toward the centre table with his back to the service corridor and did not see it coming. The ladle's worth of French onion caught his left shoulder and spread. He stood still. The room went briefly quiet. Then the room went back to itself, unevenly, in the way rooms do when people are deciding whether what they saw was as bad as it looked. Cressida was across the floor in 12 steps. He watched her approach and noticed, as he had noticed before, that she looked at him with the particular expression of someone managing a problem rather than addressing a person. Her eyes did not quite meet his. They met the space just to the left of him. "Marcus, I'm going to need you off the floor." He said nothing. "There are guests present. This is a gallery event. It reflects on the hotel." He said nothing. He kept his hands at his sides. He kept his face still with the practiced effort of someone who has done this before, who has stood in this particular posture in this particular type of moment and decided long ago that composure was not surrender and silence was not agreement. "I'm sure you understand," she said. She turned. She was already moving toward Danny and the overturned cart, her voice going smooth and managerial, directing cleanup, reassigning table coverage, the machine of her authority clicking forward without a pause. She had not looked at the cart first. She had looked at Marcus first. That was the order. That was the sequence of her attention, and it had not been accidental, and he knew it, and he would not say so tonight or any other night because saying so was not what he was built for. 41 guests had looked. 41 guests now looked away, back to their soup, back to their companions, back to the Frankfurt pieces on the east wall, doing what people do when an injustice is small enough to be deniable and familiar enough to feel like weather. Marcus walked to the service corridor. He stood in the corridor for 2 minutes and 14 seconds. He would know afterward because he counted. His hands were still. He did not touch the pendant through his shirt, though the fingers of his right hand moved toward his collar and stopped. He did not pull out the postcards. He stood with the soup cooling against his back and breathed through his nose and waited for the thing in his chest to settle back to its resting place, which was somewhere behind his sternum, where it had been living for 30 years, quiet and compressed and very much alive, and not in any danger of stopping. The service corridor connected the main dining room to the kitchen staging area, and there was a framed reproduction on its east wall, a Klimt study, inexpensive, the kind of art a hotel hangs in a corridor to fill space and justify the wall. A young server named Yolanda was pressing her back against the corridor wall, her tray gripped in both hands, her face showing the particular terror of someone new to the job who has just witnessed something she doesn't have the framework for yet and does not know what the protocol is. Marcus looked at her. "You're going to be fine," he said. She nodded, not convinced. He turned and looked at the Klimt. The gold of it caught the corridor's warm overhead light and threw it back with the same unapologetic brightness it had been throwing for a century. "You know what this is?" She shook her head. Gustav Klimt, Austrian. He was working at the turn of the 20th century in a moment when Western painting was trying to decide whether ornament was honest or dishonest, whether decoration was truth or lie. He paused. He decided that ornament was the most honest thing available to him. That the surface of something, when it is applied with real intention, is not a disguise for the interior. It is an expression of it. The gold is not hiding the woman. The gold is what she is made of from the inside out. He looked at Yolanda. The surface of you tonight is your uniform and your composure. That is not a performance. That is a professional expression of everything you have prepared to do in this room. You go back out that door and you carry your tray with intention. You look at your tables the way Klimt looked at his subjects, like they are worth the full attention of the person in front of them. Yolanda looked at him for a moment. Something shifted in her posture, a degree, 2 degrees, the way a person shifts when something true has found them. She said, "Yes, sir." She went back through the door. Marcus stayed in the corridor. He went to the washroom and cleaned the soup from his jacket with cold water and a hand towel, working at it methodically, the way his grandmother had taught him to address the things that could be addressed and leave the rest for later. The stain did not come fully out. He pressed the jacket flat against his shoulders and returned to the corridor entrance. He stood near the door. Not on the floor, because Cressida had given a direct instruction, and he was not a person who refused direct instructions from supervisors regardless of the merit behind them. He did not become what the moment was asking him to become. That was not how he operated. At 7:15, the main course was in service. Through the small window in the corridor door, he could see the ordered movement of the floor. Plates arriving, glasses being topped, the slow synchronized choreography of a well-run room. He watched Yolanda move between tables with her tray level and her shoulders back, and he watched her look at the guest before she set the plate, not at the plate, and he felt the small private satisfaction of something planted in good soil. At 7:22, the woman in her 60s with the close-cropped grey hair and the kind of voice that comes from decades of boardrooms drifted from her table toward the east wall. She stood in front of one of the Frankfurt acquisitions for a moment, her wine glass held loosely, her posture that of someone who looks at art regularly enough not to perform looking at it. She moved along the wall. She stopped in front of the portrait at the south end. She stood there for a long time, longer than most people stood in front of anything. Then she turned and looked around the room. Her gaze moved with the measured deliberateness of someone accustomed to finding what she needs in a space. It passed through the corridor window and landed on Marcus standing at the door and held there for a moment. She said something to the server nearest her, and the server came to the door and pushed it open 2 inches. "Excuse me, sir, the lady at table 7 is asking about the portrait, the one at the south end of the east wall." Marcus came to the door. The woman with the grey hair looked at him across the room. She spoke at a conversational volume, knowing the room would carry it. "You work here?" "Yes, ma'am, 14 years. Do you know the history of this piece?" He paused. The pause was not uncertainty. It was the pause of a person deciding how much to say and in what register. "That is a commissioned portrait," he said. "The hotel's founder, August Fawcett, commissioned it in 1993. It is not part of the rotation. It is the hotel's own holding." "Who is the subject?" Another pause, shorter. "A woman who worked here," he said, "for 19 years. The woman with the grey hair looked at the portrait again. She looked at the hands folded on the table, the 3 objects placed before them, the rubber-banded papers, the copper pendant, the bowl. She looked at the light falling from the left. She looked back at Marcus. "She looks like someone who understood things," she said. "Yes," he said. "She did." He stepped back from the door. He heard the woman say something further to the server, something he did not catch, and then the ambient sound of the room resumed, and he returned to his position at the corridor entrance and waited. At 7:58, the dessert course was clearing. The Frankfurt team had moved along the east wall in a loose cluster, Theo Brandt slightly ahead, his two colleagues behind. They had paused at each of the 4 acquisition pieces in the rotation, exchanging low remarks, occasionally touching the edge of a frame to adjust a viewing angle. Now Theo had drifted to the south end, to the portrait that stood outside the rotation, and he was standing in front of it again with the same angled head focus he had brought at 5:15. His colleagues continued past toward the far end of the wall, and Theo stayed where he was. He stayed for 6 minutes. Marcus watched him through the corridor window. He watched the particular stillness of a person who is not simply looking at a painting, but is working through a problem that the painting is raising. He had seen that stillness before. He had practiced it himself on Saturday mornings at a kitchen table, looking at a 35-cent postcard until the thing he had not seen on the first look began to appear at the edges. At 8:03, Theo Brandt turned from the portrait and walked across the dining room toward the corridor door. He was looking at his phone, composing a message with the focused attention of someone wanting to record something before it slipped, and in his other hand he carried a small dessert tray he had picked up absently from a service stand near the wall. He pushed through the corridor door and looked up. He saw Marcus 4 feet away. He looked at Marcus. He looked at the portrait through the corridor window behind him. He looked at Marcus again. The tray slipped from his hand. It did not shatter. It did. It rang against the tile floor with a single clean, high note, and the sound of it moved through the corridor and back again, and in the dining room a few heads turned toward the corridor door and then turned back. Theo Brandt did not pick up the tray. He said, "That painting, the woman in the portrait." Marcus waited. "She is your family," Theo said. It was not a question. Marcus looked at him. He let it sit for a moment, the way you let something sit when it has arrived correctly. "My grandmother," he said. "Ruth Ellison. She worked the kitchen of this hotel from 1971 to 1990. Theo said nothing for 2 full seconds. Then he said, quietly and with the precision of a man whose professional life was the management of this kind of information, "Fawcett commissioned that portrait from Josef Aldner. Do you know that name?" Marcus knew that name. Josef Aldner had worked in Frankfurt through the 80s and 90s. He had studied portraiture under a post-expressionist tradition that valued psychological depth over technical display, and his later work had achieved a kind of stillness that his earlier portraits lacked entirely, as if he had spent 20 years learning to remove himself from what he was seeing. 2 of his portraits were in the permanent collection at the Städel Museum in Frankfurt. A third had sold at auction in 2021 for €360,000. His estate had been the subject of a major reattribution project in 2019 that had reclassified 14 pieces previously attributed to his contemporaries. Marcus had read the reattribution papers. He had found them through an art history journal subscription he had held for 11 years, paid from his own pocket because the library no longer carried the physical editions. He said, "I know the name." "We have 3 Aldner pieces in the rotation we brought tonight," Theo said. He turned and looked through the corridor window at the east wall. "Those 3 are early work, competent, well preserved. They will hold their value." He turned back. "That portrait at the south end is a late Aldner. Among his last 10 commissions, the psychological architecture of the composition, the way the light source is handled, the restraint of the colour field around the figure." He paused. "The hotel does not appear to know what it has. The piece is not in their insurance inventory at the correct valuation. It is not in their collection notes at any valuation that reflects current market." "What is current market?" Marcus said. "At auction, conservatively between $380,000 and $450,000, possibly more if the Aldner estate chooses to authenticate formally, which the reattribution project of 2019 would support." The corridor was quiet. "She is wearing a copper pendant in the portrait," Theo said. "An open hand." Marcus reached up and put 2 fingers against the front of his shirt, over the place where the pendant lay against his sternum. Theo watched that gesture. "Who do I speak to," Theo said, "about this hotel's accounting of its own collection?" At 8:12, Marcus sent a message from his phone to Leonard Osei's hotel line. 3 sentences. He said there was a matter regarding the permanent collection that required the general manager's attention when the evening permitted, and that the lead representative from the Frankfurt curatorial firm was available to speak this evening if convenient. Leonard Osei was in the corridor at 8:20. He was 53, Nigerian British, a man who had spent 30 years managing hotels in 3 countries and who possessed the specific quality that distinguishes a genuinely good general manager from a competent one. He arrived in every room as if he had been intending to arrive there all along. He took in the corridor Marcus, Theo Brandt, the tray still on the floor, and said, "Talk to me." Marcus told him. He told him in the same measured, unhurried voice he used for everything, beginning with the soup at 6:49 and the instruction to leave the floor, and ending with Theo Brandt's assessment of the portrait at the south end of the east wall and the question about the hotel's collection inventory. He spoke without editorializing and without self-pity. He described Cressida's words and her actions and her decision about the order of her attention, and then he stopped. Leonard listened without interrupting. When Marcus finished, Leonard looked at him for a moment. Then he turned to Theo. Theo gave him the assessment in the same direct terms he had given Marcus. He described the Aldner portrait's likely valuation, the reattribution research, the question of formal authentication, and the specific visual evidence of the work's period and quality. He said the 3 Frankfurt rotation pieces were fine and would perform as expected. He said the portrait at the south end was something else entirely. Then he said that the man standing in this service corridor, the man who had been removed from the dining room floor during their gallery dinner, had just demonstrated a command of Joseph Aldner's biographical context and European post-war portraiture tradition that would be unremarkable in a curatorial department and was, to be direct, extraordinary in a service corridor. Leonard Osei looked at Marcus, not at the space beside him, at him. "How long have you known what that portrait was?" "I knew the subject," Marcus said. "I knew it was Aldner's work from documentation my grandmother kept. I did not know the current market valuation." "Your grandmother's documentation?" "She kept notes on every piece in this hotel during the 19 years she worked here. Notes on the artist, the period, the condition of the work. I have them at home, 63 cards cross-referenced with her own research. She could not afford a library membership, so she used the public one on Fulton Street and took handwritten notes on index cards every Saturday for most of a decade." The sound of the dining room moved through the corridor door, the low note of an evening winding toward its close. Glasses returned to tables, the soft percussion of chairs adjusting. "And the portrait," Leonard said. "August Fawcett had it commissioned the year after she left," Marcus said. 3 years before she died, she never saw it." The corridor was quiet for a moment. Leonard said, "She knew him? Fawcett?" "She fed him breakfast for 11 years. He ate in the kitchen on Tuesday mornings when the hotel was quiet. She said he was the only employer she ever had who asked her what she thought of things. She said he had the good manners of a person who understood that courtesy costs nothing and returns considerably." Leonard stood with his hands in his jacket pockets for a few seconds. Then he looked at Theo and said he would have someone from the general manager's office contact the Frankfurt firm in the morning. He turned to Marcus. He said, "Stay here." Leonard walked back through the door. At 8:40, Cressida Vane was near the service station reviewing her post-service notes when Leonard came to stand beside her. He spoke for 90 seconds. His posture did not change. His voice did not rise. When he finished speaking, she looked up and across the room toward the corridor door, the small, involuntary look of someone whose understanding of an event has just been rearranged at its foundation. And then she looked back at him, and the expression on his face settled what remained of the question. There was nothing further to say. Marcus came back through the door at 8:42. He walked the floor for the remaining 60 minutes of service, filling glasses, clearing dessert plates, moving between tables with the unhurried authority of someone who has always belonged in the room and has simply been waiting for the room to catch up. If his jacket still carried a shadow of the afternoon's insult, no one who watched him move thought about it. His posture said nothing had happened. His posture said he was here and had always been here, and the floor was his floor, and the guests were his guests, and there was work to do. The grey-haired woman at table 7 watched him cross the room. When he came within range, she held up her empty water glass without speaking, and he filled it. As he turned to go, she said, quietly, The kind of quiet that is meant to carry no further than the two of you. She raised something worth knowing about. He paused with the picture in his hand. Yes, he said. She did. He moved to the next table. In the weeks that followed, the Aldwell engaged a professional curatorial consultant to assess its permanent collection for the first time in 11 years. The O'Brant's firm filed a formal research inquiry regarding the Aldner portrait, which the hotel's board addressed at its December meeting. The assessment confirmed the portrait's attribution. The valuation came in at $410,000, not including the potential uplift from formal estate certification. The board meeting was the first in the hotel's history to include a formal agenda item on the cultural and historical significance of the building's non-rotating permanent holdings. The minutes from that meeting, which Marcus would read later when they were distributed to relevant staff, contained a sentence he would return to more than once. The board acknowledged that the institution had held significant cultural property without adequate understanding of its provenance, and that this represented a failure of institutional stewardship that the current leadership was committed to addressing. Not the most eloquent sentence anyone had ever written, but it was in the minutes. It was in the record. At that same meeting, Leonard Osei proposed a new position, Director of Guest Experience and Cultural Programming, a role that would require demonstrated familiarity with the hotel's collection, its building history, its relationship to the neighbourhood, and its obligations as a cultural institution operating in a community with its own history of exclusion and inclusion, and the long, complicated distance between the two. He named Marcus Ellison to the role. The board approved it without dissent. Cressida Vane was transferred in mid-December to the Events Coordination Office of the hotel's property in White Plains. Her title did not change. Her seniority did not change on paper. But the floor of the Aldwell Hotel's dining room was no longer her floor, and she wouldn't be the person deciding who belonged in it. That decision would now rest in part with Marcus. He did not remark on this to anyone. It was not his way to remark on such things. In January, the Aldner portrait was moved from the south end of the east wall to the primary wall of the dining room, directly visible from the hotel's entrance, directly visible from every table in the room. The hotel commissioned a small brass plaque to be mounted on the wall beside it. It read, Ruth Ellison, 1941 to 1992. This hotel is hers too. At Marcus's request, added in smaller type below, 63 postcards, a library discard bin, 35 cents. On the first morning of his new role, Marcus arrived at the Aldwell at 7:15. The dining room was empty, the chairs still up from the overnight closing, the morning light coming through the south windows in long, flat planes that moved across the parquet floor the way light moves when there is no one present to perform for. Just light doing what it does. He walked to the primary wall. He stood in front of his grandmother's portrait, the woman in the cotton house dress with her hands folded on the kitchen table, and the three objects before her, and the light falling from the left exactly as it would fall in a kitchen, with a north-facing window in the morning. The light Ruth Ellison had worked in every day of her adult life. He took the postcards from his breast pocket, 63 of them, rubber-banded, their edges soft with years of handling, and the particular softness that comes from being touched regularly by someone who knows what they are. He slipped the rubber band off and held them in both hands. He looked at them for a moment. He didn't need to look at the top card to know which one it was. It was the Klimt. It was always the Klimt on top because that was the order Ruth had put them in, and he had never rearranged them. He looked up at the portrait, her hands, her face, the interior composure of a person who has decided that what is inside her is hers and cannot be taken. He touched the pendant through his shirt. Here is what I need you to understand. Ruth Ellison never asked permission to love what she loved. She did not wait for an invitation or a title or a credential. She walked through service corridors with paintings on the walls, and she looked at them the way August Fawcett looked at them, which was as a person who understood that a beautiful thing in a room does not belong to the room. It belongs to whoever has taught themselves to see it. She spent 35 cents and 19 years and her whole interior life building something that no lease and no employer and no floor manager with a voice that carries could ever enter and rearrange. She built it, and then she handed it to a child at a kitchen table on Saturday mornings and asked him the only question that matters. What do you see that you didn't see the first time? This is not a story about a painting. It is not a story about a hotel or a valuation or a promotion, though all of those things are real and all of those things happened. This is a story about a woman who worked in a kitchen for 19 years and understood more about what was on the walls than the people who owned the walls, and who decided that understanding was hers to keep and hers to give, and who gave it to someone who would eventually stand in the centre of a dining room and not need the room to confirm what he already knew. The room is not what gives you standing in it. What gives you standing in a room is everything you carry when you walk through the door. Some of us have been carrying things for a very long time. Quietly, without announcement, through corridors where no one thought to look, and in kitchens where the light was good, even if the credit was not. If there is something you have built in the quiet, something that belongs to you the way Ruth's 63 postcards belong to her, I want you to ask yourself her question. Look at what you have. Look again. What do you see that you didn't see the first time? The answer is yours. It was always yours. Not because someone put your name on a wall, because you kept looking. If this story found someone in you who needed it, pass it on. There are more service corridors in this world than there should be, and more people standing in them who know exactly what is on the walls. They are worth knowing. They have always been worth knowing. Marcus slipped the rubber band back around the postcards. He returned them to his breast pocket, over his heart. He turned from the portrait and looked at the room. All of it. The tables waiting for the day's first guests. The morning light moving across the floor toward the east wall. The brass plaque catching the early sun. He put his hand flat against the primary wall just below the plaque, just beside his grandmother's folded hands. Then he went to work.